Hi, my name is Ralph Scott and I'm a PhD student in politics at the University of Manchester. First, I'd like to say thanks to the Early Career Network for organising this virtual conference. Today I'm going to be presenting the results of my PhD research so far, which investigate the relationship between an individual's level of education and their political attitudes. I'm going to be doing so in this particular piece of analysis using the 1970 British Cohort Study. And here's what I'm going to talk through today. So I'm going to start by very briefly presenting why I think this question matters, and then I'm going to summarize the existing research before describing how I kind of translate that into a theoretical approach and then a modeling strategy. I'm going to, again, briefly describe the data, particularly the kind of outcome variables, dependent variables, before moving on to present the results, my interpretation of the results, and then finally the kind of next steps for this analysis. So here's a one graph summary of why I think this question matters. What's shown here is the Conservative vote share minus the Labour vote share for at the last three general elections, but broken down by a kind of broken down by level of education, split into three levels. And what you can see is a big change in political support or vote choice among those without school leaving qualifications, those with qualifications below GCSEs, who have swung massively to the Conservatives in that time, very short space of time. And that in some ways, I mean, obviously there are various things that that goes some way to understanding the 2019 general election result. So if an individual's level of education is increasingly useful in understanding their political attitudes and their behaviour, it's true in the UK as well as in other established democracies, but we don't really understand why education has that effect and whether there's a direct kind of causal role of education on attitudes and behaviour in politics, or whether education is acting as a proxy in this case. So the existing evidence, when you look at it, there are kind of three broad themes that come out on the relationship between education and political attitudes and behaviour. The first is that education is associated with increased civic and political participation, so high levels of voting among the very highly educated. The second is that education is associated with being more economically right-wing, so kind of opposing high taxes, opposing redistribution. The third is that education is linked to being more socially liberal, so things like opposing the death penalty. And then when you look at longitudinal evidence that tries to kind of dig into more of this question of is there a direct relationship between education, or is it explained by something else? This is a really good paper on the topic by Paula Surridge from 2016. And what this essentially finds is when you control for other possible explanations, the relationship between education and left-right position kind of diminishes quite significantly. But that's not true of the relationship between having a degree and being socially liberal, where there's still a very strong effect. And she actually finds a differentiated effect by degree subject, which is also very interesting. And really, the analysis I'm presenting today kind of builds on and extends this piece of research. So to talk through the kind of the theory or the model that I'm working with, I'm going to break it. Really, it can be explained. There are kind of three competing explanations, and I'm going to present these as kind of directed acyclic graphs, which are kind of visual simplifications of the causal model. To kind of explain how I'm using these, the circles which are coloured in red here they're the variables or clusters of variables that are playing a kind of explanatory role in each hypothesis. Those in grey, those kind of greyed out, are not playing a causal role or not playing an explanatory role, and the causal direction is indicated by the arrows. The Y here is the outcome variable, so political attitudes, and X is the explanatory variable. So in this case, that's education. level of education. S is selection effects here. So that's things like family background, basically anything that's prior to education. So family background, your demographic characteristics, things like that. And A are things that happen after education. So it's allocation is the reason for the A, and that's things like socioeconomic status and income. And so here in hypothesis 1, this is making the argument that the reason for the observed relationship between education and political attitudes is that they both have a shared cause, which is that of selection effects. So essentially, both are explained by things like family background and demographics, and there isn't a direct causal relationship between education and attitudes. To kind of discuss hypothesis 2, this is the allocation hypothesis, and this is making the argument that the reason for the observed relationship is a kind of mediated relationship through the role that education plays in allocation. So if you have a degree, or the more you pursue education, the more likely you are to have a professional job and to have a higher income, and that explains the observed relationship. And it's not due to a direct kind of causal, a direct relationship between education and attitudes. And then finally, hypothesis 3 is what I'm calling the absolute education hypothesis, and that's where education does have a direct causal impact on attitudes. And the way that the approach that I've taken to modelling this is to construct 6 linear regression models for the 3 political attitude scales that I'll go on to describe shortly, which are measured both at the ages of both 30 and 42. And the models are built stepwise in order to test the relative explanatory power of these different hypotheses. And so there are kind of multiple selection hypotheses. In the first model, I've just included education just so you can see the effect without any covariates. Then the kind of models build up the different selection hypotheses. So one is demographic selection, so including measures of gender and ethnicity in the model. Model number 3 is parental selection. So that's making the argument that your parental background influences your level of education, but also your attitudes. And that's including measures of things like parental social class, education itself, and their own education, and mother's authoritarianism, which was measured at the age of 5 in the British Cohort Study. The next is ability selection, so that's including measures of kind of cognitive ability, essentially kind of trying to this argument that part of the reason why people who have higher levels of education have different attitudes is because they have higher levels of cognitive ability. So just testing that, because these were measured at the age of 10. The 5th model is, and this is quite a strong test of the selection hypothesis, is including measures of the same attitudes at the age of 16. So that's essentially if the argument is the argument that's being tested there is people are differently inclined to pursue higher education if they have different attitudes. And this is saying this is to account for the possibility that the differences are there before people have their kind of their different educational paths after the age of 16. And then finally, there's a test of the allocation hypothesis, specifically socioeconomic allocation, so including measures of occupational class and an individual's income at the point where the outcome itself was measured. And then briefly, just to describe the data that I'm using, it's a very valuable source of data, the British Cohort Study, very large number of cases because it was all individuals born in England, Scotland and Wales in 1 week in April 1970. It's followed them throughout their lives, so there's been 9 waves of data collection so far. And I guess one of the real benefits for longitudinal analysis is it's not dependent on recall. These things were measured, like the majority, all of the things I'm including in this modelling were measured at the point where they were happening. And so there's that gives a kind of high degree of validity to those measures. Obviously, there are other challenges, but that's one of the things that makes this very valuable as a data set for answering this question. And then just to kind of briefly describe the dependent variables. So I'm looking at 3 attitude scales: economic left-right, racial prejudice, and authoritarianism. These are of interest in their own right because they're scales that have been demonstrated to be be valid, but they also are interesting because they both have a relationship with education, kind of bivariate relationship, but also with political behaviour, with vote choice. So that's the reason for these being the kind of the outcome variables. As you can see, within at the age of 30, each scale has a kind of relatively good degree of construct validity. But that story changes a bit once we look at the results for age 42. For whatever reason, the authoritarianism questions included in the survey age 42 don't pull together as a scale very well. They don't have a lot of inter-item correlation. And so when I present the results, what I'll be presenting is the results for the death penalty measure at both age 30 and 42. But I have also modelled this authoritarianism scale, and the results hold despite the lack of construct validity at 42. So that's just something to bear in mind. So moving on to now discuss the results, and in presenting these, what I'm going to do is show the fully specified model. So that's model 6 for each of the attitude scales at both age points. So there'll be 6 graphs and there'll be 2 on each slide. And the way that this is kind of represented graphically is through dot whisker plots. Where the dot is the estimate of the coefficient and the whisker are the kind of confidence intervals, and that's at the 95% confidence level here. I've also coloured the significant terms in purple just to kind of help visually. Note that these coefficients are unstandardized, and that's to help with comparing across models, but it means that it's difficult to compare terms within models. So some of the variables which have got very narrow confidence intervals, that's because the scale that they're measured on is it's a continuous scale compared to some which are kind of So just bear that in mind when interpreting the results. And also on each of these, it should be clear which way the scale is coded, but as you can see, the more right you are in these graphs, that means the more economically right wing you are. So the more you kind of oppose redistribution, for example. And just a final kind of point of explanation. So you can see the terms on the left, and those are kind of bracketed by their the kind of respective models that they're testing. The reference categories for the ordinal variables are so for education, both individual and parental, it's no qualifications is the reference category. For parental social class, it's skilled manual, and for our own occupational class, it's semi-routine and routine within the kind of NS SEC. So just those are the kind of categories that are missing because those are the reference categories. So to get onto the kind of substantive results. It's first worth noting that once you control for all of the competing explanations, the kind of explanatory variable that we're interested in, like level of education, doesn't show a strong relationship with economic left-right. You can see that it's in the direction that you'd expect, as in being more right-wing. There is actually something interesting in the relationship between no qualifications and qualifications below degree level but not having a degree. You can see there is a small effect there at age 30, but overall the pattern is, I mean, the variables that explain that are most helpful in understanding, and therefore the kind of hypothesis which is most useful, is occupational class and income. So the higher the kind of professional grade of the individual at the point of measurement, and the higher the income, the more right wing. It's also worth noting that attitudes at 16, that it shows a degree of stability over the life course in terms of attitudes. Attitudes at 16 are still quite predictive, even at the age of 42. So moving on to look at racial prejudice, and where on these graphs a higher score indicates being more prejudiced towards those of different races. Here you can see a clear effect of higher education at reducing prejudice at age 30, although that's diminished at age 42. One thing to consider in this, and in interpreting all of these results, is this is using kind of case-wise deletion. I'll talk a bit about that at the very end, but it means that the sample size does diminish quite a lot over time and with all of these variables included in the models. So it could be down to the number of cases that are missing that explains some of the observed null effects in the age 42 models. But another thing to note that's interesting is the relationship between reading age at 10 and kind of less prejudiced attitudes at both age points, and also the stability across all of the three attitudes looked at. Racism or racial prejudice shows the most stability from 16 to 30 to 42. As you can see, there's a kind of very strong relationship between attitudes at 16 and attitudes at both 30 and 42. And finally, to move on to look at authoritarianism, and specifically this, as I said, we're using attitudes to the death penalty. You can see how strong the relationship of having a degree is here. So yeah, I mean, even controlling for all of the other possible explanations, having a degree has an extremely strong effect. It's the kind of strongest effect in the model. And at the age of 42, there's that stability from the age of 16. So quite a lot of people's attitudes are quite set at that time point. There's a similar relationship with reading age as we saw with racial prejudice. And also interesting is that your mother's attitudes continues to influence your attitudes in later life. So the more authoritarian your mother, the more authoritarian you are likely to be as an adult. And then a final kind of presentation of the results. On this slide, this basically shows for all of the attitude sets at both time points, what's the education effect across models. And this helps to understand, or helps to demonstrate that the real strength of having a degree on attitudes towards the death penalty, which is the kind of proxy for authoritarianism, especially compared with the other, you could see as you steadily progress through the models, the effect of education diminishing. But that's not the case for attitudes towards the death penalty, which suggests that education is playing a role not explained by all of the hypotheses which have been controlled for, and therefore there does seem, there's more to investigate in terms of a possible causal role for education in liberalising people. So to kind of conclude, all else being equal, attending university appears to result in having a less racially prejudiced and more socially liberal outlook. But the same isn't true for the economic left-right position, where, in fact, if we look at the results, selection and particularly allocation, so the job you end up in and the amount that you earn, are more convincing as explanations of your kind of position on the left-right spectrum. These support the conclusions of most of the existing literature, but also develop them further by looking at a broader range of outcomes and also looking at them into later life. And that's the research. So I'm really keen to hear people's feedback and comments. It's still at an early stage of development, so please do let me know your thoughts. I get my kind of intentions around next steps are to address some of the attrition and non-response issues through multiple imputation, Also to look at alternative ways of modelling allocation, so things like social position and looking at social allocation through kind of partner status and a number of children. And then to do more to unpick this absolute education hypothesis by modelling varieties of experience of university to understand to what extent is experience of university inducing a cognitive change, and to what extent is it about your kind of peer socialization, so the group you end up in and the attitudes that reinforces. So thanks for listening, and do let me know if you of any comments or questions that you have. I look forward to hearing. Thanks.